of a Rupert Law Group. We handle exclusively E2 and E1 visas. So no matter what treaty country you're from or in what state you want to be, we can help. What kind of things, I guess, are you looking for that are not related specifically to the requirements, but are like just about the person or their thing, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, regarding language, not to get too much off topic, but language, yes. So there's kind of two things where language is a consideration. One is, yes, I mean, I've had colleagues that say, how are you going to run a business, right? And, file the necessary paperwork, do the taxes, like all of the regulatory type things, if you can't, if you don't have operational knowledge of English, right? So yes, you're right. It's not a requirement, but I have, in Juarez, in my first post as an E2 officer, we routinely would ask people would switch, after a certain point in the interview, would switch into English to try to test their ability to communicate in English. So definitely. The other reason I always tell applicants, if you are very comfortable in English, it's to your benefit to do the interview in English, because the officers, even though they'll appear to speak the language, and in most posts you get, a certain amount of instruction in the language before you go to post. Like, if you're starting a language from scratch, like Spanish, for example, you get 24 weeks to learn Spanish before you go to post. I mean, most people will tell you you can't be fluent in 24 weeks, right? So I've seen cases where applicants will get denied a visa just because the officer can't understand their responses, right? And so if you can, if you're fluent in English, it's to your benefit to do the interview in English for multiple reasons. A, you tick that box that obviously you can operate a business in the US, and also the officer is going to understand what you say, right? So that's my 2 cents on language. And then your question was more broad than that, right? Like what is the officer looking at in terms of what's not on the documents, basically, right? So my answer to that is, again, not to sound like a broken record, but the whole story has to make sense, right? Like if you say that you've had, like I had an applicant that had successful businesses in Canada and the UK, and now they were going to replicate that same business model in the US, right? And like you're coming to the officer and you're saying like you're a successful business person, right? You have 2 very successful businesses. Like you need to appear like you're in, you don't need to show up in a 3-piece suit, but you need to show up, eye contact, being able to explain the business without looking down and looking at documents, and ruffling through papers, or saying, oh, the attorney prepared it for me, I don't know what the numbers are. Like that, that as an officer, that's not going to bode well, right? Like that, how did you successfully run 2 other businesses if you don't even know the numbers, right? And you can't even tell me what the business does. So it really is about presentation. The officer does put a lot of weight on the actual interview itself, right? As attorneys, we spend a lot of time poring over the documents, and they're important, but particularly if you go to a smaller place, right? The officer is probably not going to have much time to look at those documents, and the decision is going to be made on the verbal interview. So it really is about articulating, in a nutshell, in that elevator pitch, what is in those documents. That in a lot of cases that will make or break, an approval. That's the difference between an approval and a denial.
If you have any questions about the E2 visa process or the interview, please reach out anytime. We'd love to speak with you about your E2 visa.